Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Politics in the Pub. I'm Chandran, and I'll be chairing today's session at Politics in the Pub. Before I go any further, first and foremost, let me acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Pay my respect to their elders, past and present. Now, today's topic is titled, Why Two Eminent Australian Climate Scientists See Ongoing Climate Change as a Major Social Justice Issue for the whole world. Now, you'll agree with me that the importance of this topic simply cannot be overstated. And to speak on this topic, we have two wonderful speakers with us. They are Professor Leslie Hughes from Macquarie University and Dr. Sarah Fuller, also from Macquarie Universities. I'll quickly introduce the two speakers and we can welcome them both the usual way. Now, Leslie Hughes is a distinguished professor of biology and Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research Integrity and Development at Macquarie University here in Sydney. Her research has mainly focused on the impacts of climate change on species and ecosystems. She is a former federal climate commissioner and a former lead author in the IPCC's 4th and 5th assessment report. She is also a director for WWF Australia, a member of the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists, the director of the Biodiversity Node for the NSW Adaptation Hub, and a member of the Expert Advisory Committee for Future Earth Australia. Now, the second speaker, Dr. Sarah Fuller, is a lecturer in the Department of Geography and Planning at Macquarie University in Sydney. Her research explores concepts and practices of justice and democracy in the field of the environment with an empirical focus on the role of NGOs and communities in enacting a low-carbon transition. She has a strong commitment to research that is both policy-oriented and academically relevant. Prior to joining Macquarie University, she held positions as a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Public Policy, City University of Hong Kong, and as a research associate in the Department of Geography, Durham University, UK. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Leslie Hughes and Sarah Fuller the usual way. May I now invite Leslie Hughes to the microphone.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out to hear us speak tonight. I think you should consider me the sort of warm-up act because it's actually Sarah who's the expert on social justice and climate change. As the introduction indicated, I'm a biologist and ecologist. I have been looking at the impacts of climate change on species and ecosystems for more than 20 years, which does make me feel old. But in doing that...
Starting, my dear.
Just starting, thank you very much. But in doing that, of course, I've become interested in the impacts of climate change on all sorts of things, including us, humans. So what I'm going to do tonight is really talk a little bit about a sort of an introduction to what's been happening, talk about some of the milestones that we've just experienced and are experiencing. I want to talk a little bit about the Paris Climate Agreement, what that means for us all, what that means for Australia, why Australia is particularly vulnerable. And because this, of course, is politics in the pub, I will be getting a little bit political. I won't be completely partisan. One of the things that was not mentioned was that I'm a councillor with the Climate Council of Australia, and we try very hard to be non-partisan in terms of climate change policy. But I'll see how I go with that. It's hard sometimes. All right, well, here on Earth, we just hit an unfortunate milestone. That is, we passed the 400 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere just recently, as measured at Cape Grim, which is one of the monitoring stations currently under threat from loss of staff due to the cuts to CSIRO climate science. Now, reaching 400 parts per million means that we now have more CO2 in the atmosphere than at any time in at least the last 800,000 years, probably for several million years. We are way outside the natural envelope of variability of this particular greenhouse gas. And about 190 years ago, a very smart physicist, mathematician, polymath called Jean-Baptiste Fourier worked out what the relationship with greenhouse gases, though they weren't called that then, and the Earth's temperature could be. So we've had 190 years of science on this topic. It is not a new topic. Some amongst us are rather slow learners, and I'll leave you to figure out who I think that might be. Fast forward to last year, 2015, was the warmest year ever recorded on the planet, and it beat the previous record, which was in 2014. And this year, 2016, the first few months of this year have been so warm globally that it's very likely that 2016 will beat the previous records. In fact, I think it's something like 14 of the 15 hottest years on record have been this century. So clearly there is something going on. We've had about a degree of warming since pre-industrial times. I'll try and explain why a degree is actually quite significant. When we get to 1.5 degrees, we will have the warmest planet than at any time while humans have been on Earth. The difference between an ice age and a non-ice age is 5 degrees. So it doesn't take very much for the Earth to go from one pretty significant climate state to another. Now, here in Australia, we're considered the most vulnerable of the developed countries to climate change, and that is because we have an extremely variable climate already, and we have an extremely arid climate over most of the continent. And other sources of vulnerability are things like our unique flora and fauna, including the Great Barrier Reef, and I might talk a bit about that later on. And the fact that because we have such an arid continent, most of our population lives around the coast, and so we are subject, and most of our valuable infrastructure is subject to the impacts of storm surges and sea level rise. Sea levels have been going up about 3 millimetres a year, more so. This century it was about 2 millimetres a year last century, and they're going up for a couple of reasons. More fresh water going into the oceans from the melting of glaciers and polar ice caps, and also the fact that warmer oceans, and the oceans are actually absorbing about 90% of the additional heat in the Earth's system. Warmer water just is a larger volume than cooler water, so the oceans are expanding in volume, and that's contributing about half of that sea level rise. I want to say a little bit about the Paris Climate Agreement, because it was such a hot topic a short time ago. It was a really significant and landmark agreement. Australia has signed it, I'm pleased to say, just like 194 other countries. It was significant for a number of reasons. One of those reasons was that in going into the Paris climate meeting, and there were 38,000 delegates, of which 10,000 were government representatives. I was one of those 38,000. It was a huge privilege to be there, and quite an extraordinary experience. But in going into that Paris Climate Agreement, all the countries that went, or at least most of them, made a pledge beforehand as to what their greenhouse gas emission reductions would be. The pledge that Australia made was that we would reduce our emissions 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2030. If you put the US, for example, on the same baseline, the US commitment is for a 41% reduction relative to 2005. And you might wonder why 2005 was chosen. It's a pretty cynical reason. 2005 was a very high year for emissions. So when you compare yourself to the highest year, you'll do the best you can. Overall, in adding up all the pledges under the Paris Climate Agreement, Australia is actually at the back, way at the back of the pack of climate commitment. much further behind the US, the EU, the UK, Germany, most other countries, and a lot further behind most developing countries. So that is, I guess, a political statement, but it's also a statement of fact. Here in Australia, we currently have, or at least in 2013, we were producing about 13.5% of our electricity from renewable energy. Unfortunately, then, due to the uncertainty in the renewable energy target, our investment in renewable energy dropped by 88% between 2014 compared to 2013. It is now slowly recovering. The different political parties have made different commitments to renewable energy. Labor has pledged 50% renewables by 2030. All of these things will be challenges. The main challenge is that Australia, and we are all very prosperous here in this country because we dig up coal and we sell it all over the world. When we look at what's called the carbon budget, which is the amount of carbon we can all afford to put into the atmosphere to keep temperatures to less than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, it's been calculated that about 90% of Australia's fossil fuel reserves need to stay in the ground, unburnt, unmined and unsold. Which brings me a bit more of politics, I suppose, which is this current election campaign. And I'm sure there's many in the audience that are as frustrated as me in wanting climate change to actually be part of the discourse about the election. It seems that both major political parties do not want that to happen, and it's been very much off the radar, though we have about 5 weeks to go, so there's plenty of time to get it back on. I want to emphasise that if climate change was an easy problem to solve, we would have solved it by now. If I compare it to solving, or at least nearly solving, the ozone problem, you'll see what a contrast it is. The first significant scientific paper about the problem with the ozone layer and what was causing it came out in Science or Nature. 18 months later, the Montreal Protocol was ratified. 18 months. There was a solution, a global solution that everybody signed on to, and it is having an impact. Unfortunately, climate change is a far more difficult problem, though the Montreal Protocol and the ozone issue does actually show that the world can come together to solve a big problem if there is enough political will. There is no single solution. The solution does not just lie with federal governments. It lies with business, with communities, with individuals, with subnational governments and with international cooperation. But really the main thing to keep in mind is that from a science perspective, what happens in the next few years, here to 2020, the Climate Council has been pushing this idea that this is the critical decade for action. What happens in the next 5 years or so to peak emissions and reduce them will actually determine the climate that our children and grandchildren experience. We have to turn emissions down by 2020. We don't know where tipping points in the climate system might be. We may have even passed some of those critical tipping points. So let me finish then with observations about the Great Barrier Reef, because while it is an ecosystem, climate change is often simply portrayed as an environmental issue. It's not just an environmental issue, of course, it's an economic issue, it's a societal issue, it's a people issue. But if I end by talking about the Great Barrier Reef, we are now in the middle of the most severe global bleaching event on record. It's the third such global event ever sort of declared. The first one was in 1998 and the second in 2002. If we look at our own Great Barrier Reef, which employs 70,000 people and brings $6 billion into the Australian economy, if we add up all the number of individual reefs that have been affected, 93% are showing some degree of bleaching, and those in the north that have never bleached before are the most severely affected. And then if we look beyond our own shores, and sure, the Great Barrier Reef, if we lose it, it's a shame. It's a shame for our economy. It's a shame for those of us that go and like snorkelling. But it's also a social justice issue because 500 million people throughout the world, mostly in developing countries, rely on coral reefs for their livelihood, for their protein and for their livelihoods. So it just shows how the impact of climate change on, in this case, a really critical natural resource is also a social justice issue. So with that, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Sarah Fuller. Thanks, Sarah.